Hello, BookTube. It's a bleak and barren Sunday here at Hyde Cottage, and for those of you who are new to the party, that's my whining nickname for Sundays, when I get no mail. Sundays are bleak and barren because I get no free books in the mail, and I have to crawl along with a miserable tiny handful of books I already have. And to console myself, I do tags on Sunday, and I have a bunch, a backlog that I have to get to. And the one I've got today on the MacBook here is the Scholars book tag, which was created by Josh at Literary Gladiators, and he actually tagged me. And I want to offer a preemptive apology. This is all about scholarly treatment of literature and scholarship itself. So there's a bit of tedium involved here. This is a far more personal subject of a tag for me than it will be for, I think, most people who will do it. But anyway, now that you know, we'll go on to question number 1. Which lesser-known writer do you feel more people need to read and study? And right away, we're at the example of why. This is I am a big fan of a large number of lesser-known authors that I wish more people could read. Even in answer to this question, I had to split it between ancient and modern. And in the ancient world, one author that I absolutely love, that I wish were more in the public eye, or more taught, or more known, is Lucian of Samosata, who was a Syrian author who was raised and educated in Greek, and who wrote an enormous amount of stuff, satires, plays, biting essays, a theme running throughout a lot of his work, which is kind of rare, not for the ancient world, but for anything that survived the Christian purge of the ancient world, is that a lot of the time that he's writing mocking the whole idea of believing in the supernatural. And in a properly spry English language translation, he would still be funny. He's actually a funny author. And yet, I know that like 70 or 80 years ago, Penguin Classics did a thin volume, I think, of selected sketches, I think they called it. And a few years after that, a few decades after that, Penguin also updated that. They gave it a clever title that I'm now ironically blanking on, something to do with courtesans. That was a new updated version of their Lucian. But that's it. Nobody talks about him, nobody knows him, and considering the wastage of time, we have a huge amount of his material. I'd be willing to bet that outside of Latin trots, like the Rome's Library or the Loeb Classical Library, I bet there are huge chunks of Lucian that have never been translated into a popular edition of English. Can you imagine? After 2,000 years. So he would be one of them. There are many others. And then if we move to the modern day, roughly modern day, let's say in the last 200 years, the list is endless. Literally endless. You could go region by region, country by country, literally endless. The one that I came up with just off the top of my head for this tag was Alexander Phillips, who was a writer of novels and short stories in the 19th century in America, and who's well worth being reprinted. He's well worth finding, and yet even at the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston, a secondhand bookshop that has an enormous turnover, so I see pretty much everything there. I don't think I've ever seen a volume of his. They're probably in some minor way collectible, but nobody reads them. And once upon a time, lots and lots of people did, and they really liked him. That's because he's really likable. He's really talented. So, but I could go on, and there are many, many examples. We'll get to more of them in this tag. Question number 2 is question number 2 is brutal. Joss is not a brutal person, but he had to include a question like this, and you're going to step on toes if you answer a question like this. So we'll just power on through. Which well-known writer do you feel garners too much attention, is overrated, or studied too much, if there is such a thing? There most certainly is such a thing, and the very first name that came to mind is Sylvia Plath. There you go. So in certain quarters there would be howling, but nevertheless, she's a third-rate talent and is compulsively studied, I believe, for biographical rather than literary reasons. And that drives me nuts. That really drives me nuts. But one way or another, I mean, I could, again, with this one, as with all the other questions on this tag, I could go on for a whole hour just on this one question. But I'll stick with her for now. She's the one that bothers me today. Question number 3 is a writer or work you believe will still be in the canon in 2050. And I don't have an answer, because the canon, for the first time that I know of, has been completely co-opted by politics, by not only left-wing, right-wing politics in high schools and grammar schools, and especially in academia, but also by identity politics. With tenured English professors in America calling for the abolition of ever reading anything written by a white man, as if it being written by a white man makes the slightest bit of difference. As if there are tenured English professors leading the fight not to expose, is the word they use. Like they were talking about radiation, not to expose their fragile young snowflake students to authors, to male white authors who are bristling with, white privilege, but rather instead to read only authors who are, I don't know, if you've got 2 Puerto Ricans in class, then they should read a fellow 18-year-old Puerto Rican author. That kind of nonsense has so fully infiltrated academia in 2018 that I myself don't believe that the canon that we know of and that we've talked about on this channel many times, these works that have been venerated and studied with an enormous amount of pleasure and value for thousands of years, I don't believe that any of them will be studied in 2050. I believe that movement is only going to gather strength, despite how many vocal opponents it has. I believe it's only going to gather strength to the point where, especially since students come to their freshman year in college now armed with lawyers as well as parents. So a student is going to go to a teacher and say, I noticed that in this reading list of 30 authors, you have a white man who appears to be, from the limited amount of Wikipedia that I've done, he appears to be straight. He's been dead for 100 years, but he appears to have been a straight white man. He produced children and raised them. And that triggers me. And I don't want to end up in a hospital. But if I read even a single word by that author, I will go into anaphylactic shock and I will need to go to a hospital. And you will be held legally responsible. So since there's a medical problem involved, I insist that author be removed from the list. And all of that is a lie. There's no such thing as triggering. There's no such thing as shock. I've seen alleged booktubers just proudly, calmly, dramatically say to the camera, I can't actually read that author because then I would go into shock and I would need to go to the hospital. And that's not true, no matter how you bob your head to it. It's just a lie. And nevertheless, there isn't a teacher anywhere in the country who is going to risk that in order to defend Henry Fielding. They'll just give him up. That's all. They'll just give him up. Faced with pressure from above in their own departments and below from incoming snot-nosed 18-year-olds who think they know everything and don't want to know that they don't, those professors will cave and either toe the line or quietly find work elsewhere. So by 2050, the Greek tragedians won't be taught. They lived in a world in which slavery was tolerated. Shakespeare won't be taught. Cis white male. As far as we know. No, I don't even want to hazard a guess which books will still be around in 2050. I don't want to know. I try not even to look. I used to every year, because I know young people. I know college undergraduates. Every year I used to go online and do just kind of a quick ranging tour to horizon of what schools are requiring in their entry literature courses, what they're doing with it, what angles they're approaching. I don't do that anymore, and I don't ever want to anymore. The results are far, far too depressing. So 2050, you're on your own. We'll be fine here on BookTube, because on BookTube we don't care about that kind of crap. At least most of us don't, and want to go where there's depth, where there's deep water, and we don't care who takes us there. But academia, it's a very different thing. So let's just move on. Question number 4: a writer from your area, state, or country who you believe deserves more recognition. If we go here for the minute with the popular folkloric belief that my area is Boston, Massachusetts, then there are endless names, just endless names. I'm going to give you one, picked literally at random. There are 100 names that I could give you. I'm going to talk about Edward Howard House, who wrote for the dear old Boston Courier, a dear old raggedy newspaper that was so popular and so much fun and produced so much good work for years. And he wrote for them. He wrote opinion pieces. He wrote book reviews. He wrote music reviews. He wrote theater reviews. And he was just wonderful. A really fast, really good, graceful writer. Also, when he just started at the Courier, when he was a kid, when he was 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, you're going to have to take my word for it because I doubt there are any photos that exist of Edward Howard House. But if when he was just starting out, he was a long-haired cutie patootie. And he garnered a reputation at the dear old Courier. He garnered a reputation. His people noticed his stuff, especially people coming in from out of town and reading the Courier. And he eventually got higher profile paid work at the New York Tribune, doing the same stuff. Periodical stuff, deadline stuff, paid by the word stuff, and eventually moved to Japan. While still a very young man, moved to Japan, and not the first Bostonian to experience this, and not the last, fell in love with Tokyo. Just fell in love with it. Eventually centered his whole life on Tokyo, wrote a few books about Tokyo, was awarded literary merit awards, given literary awards by, I think he got an award from the emperor. It's not all Bostonians did. I think he died there and was buried there. He suffered from rheumatism and arthritis and gout for almost all of his life. Even when he was a long-haired, floppy-shouldered kid at the Courier doing whatever work he could get, he was already kind of sick. And it's a little sad. It adds an element of tragedy to his life, because if he'd lived only a few decades later, it would have been trivial to fix his complaints. He didn't, so he died. But he's a good example of what was the prompt here? A writer from your area that you believe deserves more recognition. Some of his writing, first of all, his travel writing, his writing about Tokyo definitely deserves to be reprinted. But also, a note we're going to hit elsewhere in this tag, he wrote a mountain of stuff under his own byline that he cared about. Now, the works that he reviewed or analyzed, most of them are gone and are never coming back. So that, in terms of reprinting his work, that's one huge hurdle. A publisher would have to think, they'd have to research it and give you a little paragraph synopsis. And that's a huge amount of work for some of this stuff that was ever heard of. And actually finding the print copies of the stuff that he wrote is not going to be easy. He didn't just do it for the Courier. He did it wherever anybody had a hole, wherever anybody had an opening, he would go, because it was a small amount of money that would, as any freelancer out there is going to nod their head, it's a small amount of money you can do for a little work, and then you've got a bill, and you can just pay it with that one freelance check. And this was the same then. This was 150 years ago. It was the same then. So there's a huge body of work of his that could be studied as a reflection of a very cool, clear, smart eye looking at the art and music of his time. If only it could be collected and found. So he's one small example. I warned you, a scholarship tag is going to be teased. But let's see, let's move on. Right. Question number 5, a deceased writer that you feel should have won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And for this, I chose Floyd Murchison, who was a cabbie in the early 1950s in Midtown Manhattan. And when he was writing out receipts for businessmen, when the flag was down and the ride was over and the business needed a receipt in order to, bill their company, when he was writing out the receipt, he would put dirty limericks at the bottom. And I've often thought that easily merits a Nobel Prize for him, and yet he never got it. He was never in the running, as far as I know. And then question number 6 is a living writer that you feel should win the Nobel Prize in Literature. And for this, I have Florence Mendez, who's an overnight security guard at a medical insurance company in Dayton, Ohio, who spends the nighttime while she's there at her desk doing crossword puzzles, the New York Times and a couple of others. And when a crossword puzzle is particularly tough, she will write in the margin at the bottom of the page, "This one is particularly tough." And she's been doing that for years now. Just that same sentence over and over again on various newspapers. And I think if we could find them and collect them and maybe give the volume a title, maybe we could call it "This One's Particularly Tough." Well, and those two answers are meant as my way of saying that the Nobel Prize in Literature is completely meaningless. It became completely, retroactively and also forever afterwards, completely meaningless when it was given to an illiterate cokehead who ineptly sang lyrics 100 years ago written by other people. If you're going to give the Nobel Prize in Literature to someone who can neither read nor write nor even sing, then your prize is worthless. I was actually, where the last time it happened, I was outraged. This year, I was actually happy that there's no Nobel Prize in Literature. Why should there be? What difference does it make? Who cares if Murakami gets it for a lifetime of working over sentences if it can be given to somebody who doesn't even read English? So, no offense to Floyd or Florence, but it could go to anybody. Who cares about the Nobel Prize? That prize that year removed the Nobel Prize from the landscape of literary prizes. Not just retroactively. You can look at previous winners and say, yeah, they're really great, but now you have to look at them and say, yeah, they're really great, but the prize doesn't mean anything because they gave it to Dylan. And when they reinstate it and continue on, they could give it to the most worthy person in the world. They could give it to Hilary Mantel. And yeah, everybody would nod and they'd say, yeah, I really like Hilary Mantel's novels. And then what would they say? What would they have to say from now on? Yeah, I really like her novels, but they also gave it to Dylan. So it doesn't really matter. So I will revisit the subject later on in some other future tag and just substitute literary prizes that do still matter. But for the Nobel, who cares? Question number 7. A writer you feel needs a complete anthology of their work. A complete anthology, it sounds like a volume, but I'm going to say here a standard reissue of their work. So something pretty, something nice, matching trade paperbacks, annotated with new introductions, where you have a whole shelf. You have everything that they wrote. And for this particular author, it would be a whole bookcase. This is an author who lived, I think, the first 80 years of the 20th century and then popped his cogs sometime in the I think, early 80s or maybe the late 1970s. It's Francis Van Wyck Mason, whose name will be known to some of you because he wrote big, fat, old-fashioned, wonderful historical novels that were sometimes reprinted in cheap mass-market paperbacks that you still sometimes see in used bookstores. And you will sometimes see his dust-jacketed hardcovers at yard sales or library sales or attic sales or whatever. He's now entirely gone. And it wasn't just the big novels that he wrote. He was incredibly prolific. He wrote a ton of historical fiction, a ton of contemporary fiction. He wrote really fun murder mysteries. His murder mysteries, they're all gone, and I think they've been gone forever, but they're really enjoyable to read. He also wrote, say it with me now, tons and tons and tons of uncollected book reviews. It's the thing about this scholar book tag that I could underscore from the beginning to the end, which is that when you talk about a writer, I mean, Francis Van Wyck Mason is not a major author anymore. Only people who've read him, readers of a certain age will even know who he is, and they will never have read all of him. And he's never coming back, I don't think. I'm calling, in my answer to this question, I'm calling for big standard issue reprint of him. I think that would be wonderful. I think if you reintroduced him to a new audience, they'd love him. But I don't think it's ever going to happen. But the point that you can make all throughout this tag is that when you talk about an author, in his own day, he was a major author. He was well known. He was a popular bestseller. Every bookstore clerk had to know the names of his books. They had to know the rough plot outlines because customers were going to come in and ask for it without clear information. He was one of those authors then. There are authors like that now. He's not one of them anymore. But once upon a time, he was a household name among readers. And he's gone completely. But even if you did a variorum edition of his work, in his case, as in the case of so many even much better known authors, you would be leaving out a whole body of what they wrote, a whole bookcase of what they wrote, because I guarantee you, almost every case, almost every time, these authors, A, B, and C list authors, all did what I described. Freelance book reviewing, freelance book ethic, essays and reactions and whatnot, theater reviews, play reviews, movie reviews, where so-and-so, I know him well. He's the arts or editorial editor of a certain newspaper. He's willing to give me $60 for this, and it just so happens that I need $60. So in addition to the huge work with a capital W and italics and stroking the goatee, in addition to that, I will also happily dash off something about the new, Mainwaring novel. I will happily do that because you've got a spot on your page you need to fill. You've asked me, and I know your money's good, so I will do that. Virtually every author that you can think of did that for virtually all of their career, and people don't. Their scholarly executives simply ignore it. If the author themselves draws attention to it, like, for instance, John Updike steadily made books out of all that work himself, in addition to writing his novels. If an author doesn't do that, I've often seen the encyclopedia entries for these authors ignore the fact that it even happened. So they'll say, an encyclopedia entry for, I don't even know, name an author, will say they briefly worked at such and such a newspaper, then they sold their first novel, and from there they sold a collection of short stories, then they sold a big novel, and one of their novels was made into a movie, and the entry in the encyclopedia goes on from there without ever mentioning the fact that when they worked for that newspaper, they wrote a mountain of material under their own name. It just never happens. You talk about who? Edith Wharton, Thomas Wolfe, you name it. You name almost any, certainly almost any author in the late 19th or all the span of the 20th century. Almost anybody that you could name, Eudora Welty, Flannery O'Connor, you name them, and they wrote a whole, you think, okay, I've got a shelf of them, and they're my favorite author, I'm so happy to have all of their books. But in reality, they wrote that shelf, and then this whole other shelf, this whole other bookcase full of stuff that you don't know about, that you've never read, because no one's ever found it. Usually for two reasons. Either A, because these things are hard to find. A lot of them are not on microfiche or anything. They're in moldy newspapers. You have to go and get them. And B, a lot of times literary executors and people who study these authors, or even the authors themselves, will have snobbish reasons for ignoring them. They'll say, well, it's not good. I had one day to do it, so I dashed it off. I don't think either one of those are very good reasons. If you finish Clarissa, for instance, by Samuel Richardson, widely considered to be the father of the novel in English. If you finish Clarissa, which, you might not end up doing, but if you did, you would end up liking it. It's a fantastic book. It's huge. It's, 2,000 pages long, but it's fantastic. When you finish that and you realize, then you go to Wikipedia and you see that this guy Richardson wrote a bunch of other stuff, and you want to read it all, and maybe you do read it all. When you're finished, you'll think, gee, I wish there was more Richardson. And there is. There is. There's a whole library more Richardson. He dashed off reviews all of his life. So did all of these people. And that's what that could be my answer to all of the questions on this tag, is that we don't have that material. We don't have collected volumes of that material. That bothers me. There's lots of work still to be done. And Van Wyck Mason is the same way. Because in addition to the Variorum edition, this set new trade paperback, pretty reprint set of his work, I would love to see a volume or two or three of stuff of his that's never been reprinted, that's never been collected. And it would be that. It would be his deadline prose that he did for money. That his life would have been very different, very much harder, very much worse if he hadn't written that prose. And those of you who are writers out there, I think you agree with me that if you've got a blank page in your typewriter and it's under your byline, it could be as dashed off as, a sneeze. It's still going to have you in it. It's not like you're going to write it like a robot. Your voice is going to be in it. If you need proof of that, all you have to do is look at the collected book reviews of Virginia Woolf, which do exist in something like their complete amount. And even when it's obviously something that she wrote very quickly about an obviously trivial work of the day, her voice is still there. It's still worth reading. If you were given a choice between having it gone or having it there, you'd want it here. Same thing with everybody else. Same thing with all these other authors. I wish that the Van Wyck Mason reprint set that I'm imagining had all kinds of other stuff too, not just Three Harbors or any of the books that were famous in his day. Anyways, let's move on here. Question number 8 is a translated work you feel deserves recognition. And I thought when I read this answer, when I read this question, I thought about works that haven't been translated. I thought, because the number of works that have been translated is so minuscule compared to the number of works out there. And the minute I thought about authors who've only had a tiny fraction of their work translated, I thought about Ireland, where a large percentage of great writers wrote in the Irish. They wrote they didn't write in English. Even if they knew English, even if they talked in English, even if they did business in English, they made a point, it was a movement, to write in Irish. And a large number of those authors have not been translated or have only had a tiny amount translated. And there was a Donegal author, for instance, endlessly productive, endlessly inventive. I'm trying to think how you would say his name, or what the Englishized version of his name would be. It's Séamus Ó Grianna, I think is how you would pronounce his name. You would Englishify it, Ó Grianna or Grania. He has been translated in a tiny fraction of what he wrote. He wrote a play. He wrote a novel that was adapted to a play, and the play was a hit, a modest hit. But a huge proportion of what he wrote, novels, short stories, and, again, a vast amount of deadline prose journalism, has never been translated. And this is a guy who I think would find a very wide audience if it were. He wrote a couple of major novels and a ton of really good short stories. And as far as I know, 99.9% of his work has never been translated. And he's just one example. Oh my God, you would come up with a million. The two literary traditions I can think of off the top of my head when I was thinking of this, that come to mind as good examples of that, is Ireland and Japan, where there's a vast number of authors who I believe would be attractive to a wider audience who are simply not translated in the last 150 years. Just huge amounts of great stuff that's not translated. Except the only difference being that when it comes to the Japanese authors who fit that description, I am going by the accounts of friends of mine who have read their stuff and are assuring me. Whereas when it comes to the Irish authors, I can tell you directly that the stuff exists and it isn't there for you to read in English, and that's infuriating. So I'm going to use him. I'm going to use Séamus Ó Grianna for that. And then question number 9 is a work of nonfiction that you feel needs to be studied. And for this, unfortunately, I'm going to use a modern book. There's an author, David K. Johnston. He's a heck of a guy. He's a bit of an egomaniac, but he's a fantastic writer and a fantastic researcher, fantastic journalist. Really knows how to write on the page. You don't stop reading one of his books. And he wrote a book just recently called It's Even Worse Than You Think, about the Trump presidency, about the beginning of the Trump presidency. It was a follow-up to a book that he wrote earlier called The Making of Donald Trump. It's tremendously good. It's well worth your time to read. It will open your eyes to a lot if you haven't been following. David and I have been following this guy since the first time that, like a cockroach, he crawled across the clean carpet of civilization, of civilized society. But most people haven't, and think of him only as the host of The Apprentice or whatever. So The Making of Donald Trump is a great book to read, but It's Even Worse Than You Think is even more important. It is a work of nonfiction that everyone should read. And even it, I believe, will be completely overshadowed by the work that David K. Johnston does next, by the next book that he writes. I think it's obvious. I could be wrong. I have sometimes predicted these things wrong, but I think it's obvious that he's going to stick with this subject. And I think it's, again, tough to predict, but if I had to predict, I would say he's the one who's going to write the great book about the Trump presidency, even if that presidency is still ongoing when he does it. So I think he'll write the first great book on it, and we'll see. But I'm going to use that as a recommendation. If I remember correctly, I'll try and put some of these things down below because I've unloaded a lot of material here. Then the next question is, if you could teach any 5 literature-based classes, what would they be? Just as a hypothetical here, not like I've ever done that. And just as a hypothetical, I'm going to say Greek mythology, World Mythology 101, the Gospels as books, Roman historical fiction, and Composition 101. I just have a wild idea that I might be good at teaching those classes. And then question number 11 is, who do you tag? And this is a little old now, this tag, and I don't know how many people have done it or would even feel inclined to do it. And I confess, now that I'm at the end of the video, that I'm a little fuzzy on who Josh tagged, so I might be double tagging people here. But I have Barter Hordes, Britta, Sean the Bookmaniac, Lukash at his channel, and Mark at Richardson Reads. I'd love to hear variations on these answers from all of you. And that's it. That is my tag on a bleak and barren Sunday that isn't completely awash weather-wise, so that's nice. It's one of those days where the sky is a patchwork of threatening gray and sunlight, so that you know the air is very unsettled and a thunderstorm could happen, but nothing has happened yet or even come close. So it's an open window day, which is nice. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, and I will see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.